Well, as late spring dissolves into summer, as the seasons change, so do the flies on which trout feed and the flies which we imitate to try and catch them. Habitat, the changing of habitat, has influenced species more than anything on this earth, but sometimes man helps them. Kestrels, for instance, love our motorways, and as we've built these vast public service reservoirs, so you have huge hatches of non-biting midges called chironomids. Bob, terribly important to reservoir fishermen.
Absolutely, Terry, yes. I would say it's the staple diet nowadays of reservoir trout.
From April?
Well, yeah, from April, May, June, part of July, and then it starts to slow off a little bit. But prior to April, there's such things as the bloodworm and the larva, so yeah, I would say it's the all-round staple diet of the lake trout.
Yeah. Their life history, Bob?
Well, like most things, they start from the egg and then develop into a larva, which pupates, and then onto the adult. All these stages are taken, apart from the egg, of course, by the trout. And as the season progresses, the trout rise to the surface for the pupa, whereas in the early part of the season, okay, they'll feed perhaps on the larvae. We sometimes get trout with stomachs full of larvae, and then as the season progresses into April, May, the buzzer pupa, and then they really turn on to the adults also, taking the fly spent in the surface or even washed underneath.
Wonderful protein for trout.
Absolutely. It packs more weight on perhaps than most things.
Well, of course, there isn't only the non-biting midges, the chironomids. You do get some upwing flies, some ephemerids on still waters.
That's quite right, Terry. There are three main ones. The pond olive, the lake olive, and the minute canis, the fisherman's curse. But I tend to concentrate mainly on the lake olive. Dressed in two sizes, 14s and 12s, I find it covers this particular hatch perfectly.
And you fish it, the nymph, the dun on the surface, and then the spinner probably in the evening?
That's correct, yes, all three stages. It's best to edge your bets, as I say.
Now, what artificials do you use, Bob, to imitate, well, first the chironomids, the buzzers,
yes,
and then your lake olives?
Well, as you can see, Terry, exactly as you've said, we've got dark ones, black, light olive,
yeah,
coming down dark olives, clarets, the whole spectrum.
Right up to blood red here?
Blood red, yeah, that's right.
And what about your lake olives?
Well, the lake olives, yeah.
Do you fish both wet and dry?
I do. I'll show you the wet one first. This is the...
That's a pretty fly, isn't it?
Yes.
Really, well, it's a very greenish fly, really. It's more green than olive, in fact.
Well, I've overemphasised it, and I think the trout pick it out because of that.
I think when there's a fair hatch, overemphasis is a jolly good thing.
It seems to work for me, Terry. And also the Greenwood's Glory. That also doubles very nicely.
Yeah, a little bit of green on the end there.
Yeah, a little fluorescent green tag.
Yeah, and your dry fly is the same body, but it's a bit more hackle.
That's right. It's virtually the same fly, but a stiffer hackle and the same split wing, but this time sitting in the surface film as opposed to underneath.
Now then, Bob, where are your favourite waters for buzzers and lake olives?
Oh, I've got two favourite waters at the moment, Terry. Eyebrook, very prolific water, nice shallows, fertile bottom, good buzzer hatches, good olive hatches, and Rutland Water, which is very well established now. Tremendous hatches have got to be seen to be believed.
Which of the two are you going to now?
Well, today I've chosen Rutland Water.
Well, you better get there then.
OK, Terry, I'll do that. Thank you. Cheers. Now, the reason I've chosen this particular point is because any point overlooking a bay is usually a hot spot. Fish that's travelling upwind of this bank will normally use this as a turning point, and any turning point's got to be a good spot. You've got fish in it all the time. The conditions at this point in time aren't particularly great. We've got a south-easterly wind, which is not particularly warm, although the sun's out, but it's a nice steady blow. But we've got this very, very bright, steely sky, which makes for a dry wind, and the insects just don't seem to like to fly in this sort of conditions. If the cloud builds later on in the day and it becomes more humid, then I think we're going to see some fish rise. But to be honest, I think for the first part of the day we're going to struggle. We're going to have to fish really hard, hope for some cloud cover, and things might start to happen. Before we start tying any of the flies, let's first examine the pinch and loop technique, because it really is a very important process in the tying of a winged fly. Right, just to demonstrate the pinch and loop, I'm going to tie it on a bare hook. It's as well for any beginner to learn to put a wing on a bare hook because you haven't got the hattles and the body in the way. And this is a pair of wing slips that's prepared in the wet style. I'm going to measure it up to the shank, hold it in position. Now the silk is taken between thumb and shank, loosely over the top and down between finger and shank, down by the finger and the shank on the other side. And at this point in time, the silk is not yet touching the actual tops of the fibres. It's pinched and looped in between the fingers and should be hanging over the top of the fibres. I'm now going to compress that by pulling directly down and repeat it twice more, and that should have it nicely in line, and the wing should be in line with the shank and nicely compressed. So there's 3 tones of silk, 3 pinch and loops, and the fibres nicely compressed, one on top of the other, directly down on top of the hook shank. The lake olive is a very effective fly from, it can be early spring, but usually middle to late spring, and on and off throughout the season. Then it starts to come into its own again towards the end of August into September. This same pattern will double quite effectively for both the pond and lake olive, but lake olives being more predominant species, then it's as well to fish it for that particular fly. The silk I'm using this time is dark olive silk, and the tail that I'm about to introduce has come from this cock cape. It's one of the larger feathers taken from the base of the cape, and you can see the superfluous fibres and fluids been stripped away. And then to select the tail, you just want 3 or 4, 5 at the outside fibres poured into an upright position to get the tips together, and then they're simply tied in on top of the shank, and they want to be approximately the length of the hook shank itself, in other words extending approximately the length of the hook shank. And there you see, nice level plane, top of the shank, and the waist can be left to hang forward while this number 2 flat gold tinsel is introduced. Introduced simply by placing it under the shank and bringing 1 turn of silk directly over the top of it, and it will hold there. The body material is going to be this dyed turkey feather. It's the tail feather from a turkey, the side tail feathers, and I'm going to snip away just 3 or 4 fibres. You don't need too much, otherwise you'll have too bulky a body. Having taken the fibres, and you say 3 or 4 fibres, that's all, trim the ends square, and once again place them under the shank so that the best side of the feather, in other words the downy side, the one with the flue or herl on it, is facing in towards the shank, which means when it's eventually wound onto the shank it will be uppermost, making a nice flue-like effect. Simply tie down all the waist ends and take the silk up the shank to just the 3/4 mark or just beyond, and then the herl can be simply wound turn in front of turn along the shank, and you can see that it's gradually building this nice velvety textured body until the silk is reached, and simply tie off with 2 or 3 turns, cut away the waist, and then the ribbing can be taken in nice open spirals, equal space spirals along the shank up to the silk, and simply tied down, and then the waist cut away. Now what we need now is a hattle which will form the legs of the fly, and this time this comes from the cape of a hen, so it's a hen hattle, and this particular feather is taken quite low down on the cape, and the length of the hattle fibres want to be approximately from the junction at which they're tied in down to the point of the hook. It's better that they extend slightly beyond than actually being in front of it. strip away the superfluous flue and fibres, and then tie in by placing under the shank 2 or 3 turns forward, clip away the waste. I'd normally break that off, but it was quite a short hattle fibre, so I've just snipped it away. Bring the hattle into the upright position, and you don't want too many turns on this. Anything between 2 and 3 turns is quite sufficient. 2 or 3 firm turns of silk, break away the waste point, stroke the hattle fibres back, and follow them with the silk to give this nice laid back sort of rake to the fibres. So there you can see the laying nicely back, gives a good entry through the water instead of making them skate along the top. And the next job now is to sort out the fibres which will form the wing. So what we normally do is to pick the feather up. This is a flight feather of a duck which has been dyed olive, and par away by inserting the scissors at the base of the feather and stroking this section out, and then simply cut it away at the base, pick out the fibres, lay them gently down so that you don't disturb the lie of the fibres. Same with this second feather. And I think the main thing we've got to point out at this point is that these 2 feathers are indeed matched feathers, but they come from the opposing wings of the bird, so that they aren't from the same wing, the opposite feathers, and they came from the same position, and so that the 2 fibres will in fact have concave and convex edges which will oppose each other. And the idea now is to lay these 2 opposing edges into the centre. And what we do is simply lay them tip on tip and grasp them by the points, and then pair up the tail end of the feather, or the cut end, until you get the 2 matched completely together. And it is very important that these 2 do actually match together. I'll just face it towards me so that I can see it perfectly. And there you have the wing ready and prepared to be tied in. The important thing is to maintain this paired up effect, so keep stroking them delicately into position, offer them over the top of the shank, and just line the wing fibres up just beyond the bend so it balances the fly up. Offer them up in this nice parallel plane to the shank, and once measured, transfer the grip to the left hand and do this pinch and loop little routine 3 times to compress the fibres down onto the shank. And there you have the wing tied on in the wet style. In other words, it's a nice rakish wing laying down the body, and what we do now is cut away the fibres overhanging the eye of the hook so that you've got a nice tapered effect for the silk to wind down, so you haven't got any sudden steps. Build a nice neat head to the fly, and then simply, as always, go into the whip finish routine by taking turns of silk towards the eye of the hook, insert the scissors, pull the knot tight, whip away any little accumulations of wax that may be under the eye of the hook, cut away the silk, realign the wings, set the hattle fibres up, and there you have the winged wet olive. A very effective fly. The trout seem to appreciate it, and that's what it's all about. Late evening fishing on Rutland Water can prove to be a very productive period. These 2 boat anglers have obviously hit a hot spot and dropped anchor. Just to their left is a point of land which divides the bay into areas of calm and ripple. Trout are notorious for feeding along the edge of ripple as they head upwind, using the wave action to convey a steady and continual supply of food forms. In this instance, because of their greater mobility, the boat anglers have an advantage over the bank angler, But this isn't always the case. My position is very different. For most of the time it's completely calm, with only the occasional flurry to disturb the surface. This shallow shelf extends for quite a distance and is dotted with weed beds, an ideal feeding ground for both trout and swans. One of the minor disadvantages of fishing such a spot is that the flies need to be continually checked for any odd strands of weed they might pick up. Another of my problems here is that I'm having to fish quite close to this submerged fence, and behind me there is a thicket of young willow bushes. Just as boats tend to accumulate in hot spots, so do bank anglers. Always leave enough room to allow your neighbour to cover his area of water adequately. Don't crowd him. Out at the boat, those two anglers must be close to their limit by now. And another fine trout safely netted to add to their bag. A little flurry of wind ruffled the surface just within my casting distance, and sure enough, almost immediately, I had a take. Quite a boisterous fish, making fast runs, doing plenty of head shaking, and diving in and out of the weed to try and shake the hook. I'm having to take my time because this fish is so boisterous, and I've used a very small fly, the lake olive, on only a 3-pound point. And with such sudden movements from the fish, the whole lot could easily shear off. I've also got to keep the fish away from the submerged fence, so of course I'm keeping a tight line at all times.
Come on, you beauty.
Don't shake your head so much. Ah, there it is. Another nice bright rainbow. Well, that took the imitation of the lake olive. It looks quite a green fly, but I find that a nice brightish green seems to do the trick instead of being too drab. Took nicely in the scissors. There's no way that fish was going to come off. And what I'll do, I'll take it out now, and I've got one I've caught at the side of the lake, the natural fly, and we'll match it up to it and see just how the two combine. So there's the fly. Now if I can catch that one out of the jar, we'll look at the real thing. And there you can see the natural lake olive. It's quite a drab fly, still quite lively as you can see. And the one that I'm going to bring up now is the one I've just taken that fish on. And fish just subsurface, in other words, it's the natural thing actually sunk under the surface, either by wave action or because it didn't quite hatch properly. And although the colours don't match exactly, I think you'll agree that there's a pretty close resemblance there. The fish seem to think so, and that's the main thing. The polyribbed buzzer pupa, most people call it the buzzer nymph, is one of my own patterns. There are many, many versions of the buzzer nymph or buzzer pupa, but this one's got all the added appendages, making it quite a close copy imitation. As you can see, I'm going to dress this on a Yorkshire sedge hook, and I've run wax silk down to just the start of the bend. I'm now going to add the tail filaments, and these are 4 strands of DRF nylon floss. And they're held tight on top of the shank while the actual floss is tied down well round the bend, and that will later be cropped off to form a short tail. The next job is to tie in the ribbing material, which is made out of builder's gauge polythene sheet. And what I normally do is just simply get a scalpel and a rule and slice off these different widths, as you can see. And if you make them slightly varying, then you can do all sizes of hooks at one go. The next job is to do what I've done here, as you can see. I've actually stretched the polythene so it's cut and then pre-stretched prior to tying in. And what you're aiming for is a width of polythene which will give you somewhere in the region of 6 or 7 ribs. The natural insect has got 9, but I don't think the trout go around actually counting, as long as you're giving the general impression of the ribbing. Right, with your very first turn going back up the shank, the polythene is just simply trapped in. One turn will hold it, and then the next material, which we're going to actually give the body its colour and texturing, is once again herl. And in this case it's dyed goose herl. And what we do, as with the adult buzzers, take out rather a generous web of fibres. What I like to do is fold these just to give it a little bit of body, and then trim off the natural tapered end just to line it up. And that's introduced under the shank right close up to the tail fibres, so that's your second turn of silk returning up the body. And then the silk's returned up the shank, touching turns, tying down all these materials as you go, nice and neatly, no steps or bumps. And you want to aim for somewhere round about the 2/3, 3/4 position back to the eye. Right, the body can now be formed, and as with the adult buzzer and with the lake olives and all bodies in fact which use herl, you tie it with the nap or the flue facing uppermost to give this nice textured velvety effect. Simply pass round and round, one in front of the other, and then tie off 3 turns of silk. Cut away the waste. Now the body is going to be ribbed, but what we want is nice open spirals which are quite uniform, allowing a suggestion of herl just to creep up in between the segments or the turns of polythene. Tied off with 2 or 3 turns of silk on reaching the silk at anchor, and then I like to brush these back to give them a nice uniform tapered effect. The tail can now be cropped. This must be pulled quite tightly, and all you want is a short tail and make one nice clean cut. Otherwise you get a jagged appearance. Now the next job is to introduce the thorax cover. Some people call it the wing cases, but this is a little bit of a misnomer because the wing cases are going to be added after this thorax cover. So I like to keep to the wording of thorax cover. And this can be taken from the same feather as was the body material. Nice and generous with the webbing. Crop it off so there's a little sticks out from between finger and thumb so that you can actually tie it down. And then just keep checking that you're just coming up to the body so that the two make a nice union. The two come together without any sort of gaps, lumps or bumps. Now for the wing cases, as I already mentioned, a lot of people call this the wing case when it's turned over, but it's not. In this instance, the wing cases are going to be 2 little bud-like appendages which hang approximately 45 degrees below the shank and close up to the start of the thorax. And these are formed with these biot quills which come from the primary flight feather of a goose or a swan. And this was a feather that I picked up on the bank which had been shed. Swans are obviously protected, but fishermen do tend to come across a lot of feathers in their journeys. And these feathers are slightly concave in structure, and the idea is to place the concave sides to the shank itself so they hug nice and snugly to the hook. Now it's a bit tricky balancing these up, but this is the way I do it. I measure one up to the shank. Doesn't matter about the length at this point, they're going to be trimmed back later, and that's allowed to be measured for the second one, which is placed alongside it. Keep them nice and equal, then turn of silk, hold them in place, trim away, . and then bind them down nice and tightly and form a nice bed on which to put the dubbing and the thorax material. For the thorax material, we're going back to mole, natural moleskin, which was bleached. They have to be bleached before they can be dyed. A little pinch of fur and thoroughly mix it. Always mix dubbing furs to make them nice and light and airy, and this aids the dubbing process. And little and often, we just keep pinching a little piece from between finger and thumb and spinning it onto the silk, and formed a ball-like thorax. And I'm now ready to bring the wing cover over and down into position. Try and keep these nicely webbed together as they come over, and bring the silk down 3 or 4 turns. Clip away the waist, just tidy the raw ends by lashes of silk, and the head breathers are now going to be introduced, and this comes from a single strand of white daylight fluorescent wool, and all we need is a short section around about 3/4 to 1 inch long, and this is simply tied in on top of the shank with a figure of 8 lashing, which goes twice in one direction, twice in the other. Keep hold of the tufts as you do this, otherwise it'll shove them around the shank. Lock it off with one going in the direction that the first turn was taken in. Pull them back out the way so that the whip finish can then be performed. Now the main thing now is to crop them almost, or as equal as you possibly can, and to do this I usually tilt the vise towards me so I can actually study everything that I'm doing, and then pull them nice and tightly and crop, and use the first one as you measure for the second and crop. And then all they require now is to flare these out. It doesn't matter if they match the eye of the hook, as long as you've got these nice flared out head breathers. And there's just one final thing to do, and that is to trim to length the little wing case appendages and round them off. And this is done simply in this way. First cut is made directly across the quill, and then using that as a measure, clip the second one, and then take a cut at that angle, and then one round there, and just take the point off the quill. That's the way we shape them, and they both are done in this sort of manner. This picture of a natural buzzer pupa, taken by Peter Gathercole, shows all the characteristic elements: the tail, the segmented body, the wing buds, and the beautiful head plumes. You'll see that we have in fact got the little tail fibres, which do glow bluey white in the daylight because of the daylight fluorescent. We have the segmented body, the little wing bud appendages, the thorax, and the plumes around the head. Some people call these breather tubes or breather fibres, but as you can see we've got this nice aura of white around the head, just as the slide's shown you. So what we can call this is a very close copy buzzer pupa. Out in the field there's a wide range of buzzer species, an almost infinite variety of colour and size. Sometimes they are so numerous that they create dark dancing clouds, always good news for the trout fishermen. As the evening progresses and the light begins to fade, I've decided to change over to close copy adult buzzer patterns. In the late evening there is usually a fresh hatch of buzzers and also a return to the water of egg-laying females. Therefore the intensity of available adults is considerably increased. In fly fishing there are literally thousands of patterns which one could tie. My adult buzzer range of 7 individual patterns covers all the main buzzer hatches throughout the season. Packaged with this tape you will find this seasonal guide and a list of all the materials required to tie each fly. And I can guarantee that tied well and fished correctly, these buzzers will give you the kind of sport that I have enjoyed over the last 20 years. Well, as you can see, that's taken the adult buzzer. I'll just turn it over so you can see. This is a little adult buzzer. We use it normally much earlier in the spring, but they've gone on to small flies. And this is the winged adult buzzer, although it's fished subsurface in the wet style. I'll just take it out of the gill and let the camera have a better look at it. And there you see, just on his side. The wings are a little clubbed at this point, but they're normally a nice V shape. Small hook, 14. It's only on about a 3.5 pound point. That's why I had to take it quite gingerly with such a boisterous fish. Quite a lively fish this one was. Not a big fish, but very lively. What I'm going to do now is have a look at the stomach contents, see how it matches up to this particular artificial. But I think what we'll find is that it will perhaps have adults and pupa in it, perhaps more pupa than actual the adults. But let's have a look and see what happens. In goes the marrow spoon, and out it comes, absolutely full of live. Look at it, it's feeding like mad. At the time that this fish was caught, he was taking pupa. And you can see they've got a nice barred effect on them. They're all wriggling away like mad. And what I'll do, I'll put that fly outside of it so we can see a similarity in the actual size, and you'll also see that the quilliness of the body isn't a million miles out. Now the polyrib buzzer pupa, slightly different colour, but you'll get the general idea that if we lay them along the side, let's pick one out. And I think you'll agree that it's very similar. The amazing thing is here, the warmth of the sun on my hand, it's making them hatch, and it's something that we don't come across all that often. And this one's just hatched out, actually, while we just stood there examining them. So it's been taken underwater, down into a fish's gullet. I've caught the fish, spooned it out, and there they are, hatching. And if they get the wings dry and fly away, we never know, they'll go away and mate and start the life cycle all over again. And I think if we gave it long enough, every one of these little riddlers would eventually hatch out. If you look at your charts, you'll see that the suggested months for fishing the adult buzzer range is quite extensive, and each month does tend to overlap the adjoining month. But if we start in March with the Blaine black adult buzzer, you see that it starts at the beginning of season in March and overlaps, in fact, right until the last week in April. And then in April, the main fly that's on the water is the black duck fly. But this can be encountered at times from the last week in March, and it will overlap right into about the second and sometimes in the third week in May. And then when we get into May, the main adult buzzer, and they get quite large at this stage, is the grey boy, what we call the grey boy. It's a large fly which is dressed on about a size 10 hook. And the range of this fly will go somewhere between the last week or so in April and through until the last week of May. We don't really see it after that time. It's not got a very long range as the grey boy. When we move into June, we've got various olive adult buzzers, and these are all sizes and shapes, so they can be dressed on a variety of hooks from, say, 14s right up to 10s. They will begin any time from about the last week in May and right up to the end of June, and occasionally into July. But when we get into July, the large ginger adult buzzer, or some people call it the large red midge, that becomes most prominent, and the trout really do enjoy it. This can show up on the scene any time from about the third week in June, and it will go right the way through into the second week in August. So it's got quite a span. It's very attractive to the trout. In fact, I've taken my biggest on the adult buzzer range, and that was a nice brownie of £4.14. The predominant pattern for this particular month of August is the beige and ginger adult buzzer, and this will start any time from about the third week in July and overlap, believe it or not, right up until the end of September. So I would say this one's perhaps got the largest span of all. And then as the water starts to cool down, the buzzers tend to get a little smaller, but you can still fish a size 10 in the form of the large, dark olive adult buzzer. And this will take fish right up to the end of the season.
Extraordinary thing. Of course, the mayfly hatch isn't what it used to be.
Oh, no.
Pollution, drainage and so on.
Yes.
But I can remember valleys like the Kennet, when you looked out of the window of a train and you couldn't see the valley for flies.
That's right.
That's a very wee one.
It is, isn't it?
Do you know, Bob, I think there are 2 broods of mayfly.
Yes.
You know, after all these years, we still haven't sorted out whether they spend 1 year or 2 years or longer burrowed in the silt and the gravel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think there's some that come up after a year and a bit and some that come up after 2 years and a bit. And the big ones are the 2-year-old, and that, I reckon, he's a little one.
Yeah, he's perhaps just 1 year.
Let's keep him, shove him in this.
He's about
box.
a third the size of the other ones.
Yeah.
There he goes, we'll put him in there as a sample. Well, Terry, it's been a disappointing year up to now. We've had a lot of high water, and it's been very cold, as you know, and today it's cold once again. That's why I've got the jumper on, and we've got this nasty downstream wind. But nevertheless, I have a few patterns here to show you, and these usually pay off on this river.
Bob, they're beautifully tied. Don't you find sometimes with those mallard breast wings, the fly reverses itself, lands on the water with a hook in the air? Very, very effective.
More often than not, Terry, actually, because of the slight curve in the wing, it does act as a sort of a parachute fly almost.
Comes down almost like a helicopter.
That's right, yes.
You've got, in fact, what they used to call your green drake and your grey drake or spent gnat.
That's right. Well, what I normally do, I dress the dun either with a dyed wing or with a plain. The plain one, I want you to see it as it's under the far bank in and out the shadows. And I don't know why, but sometimes the trout seem to like a paler wing.
Totally different approach now. Here's Dick Harris, great fisherman, great entomologist, great fly tyer. Looks a very awkward, ugly fly, very effective
Yes.
for the female spinner on lakes in Ireland. But he, unlike you, he uses a hackle for his spent flies. That's the male, which I find easier to cast, and they don't get so bitten up
Afterwards.
afterwards when you
That's
keep
right.
catching fish.
Yeah.
It doesn't worry you.
To tie the spent mayfly, in other words the spinner, I use a 12 long-shanked hook, sort of medium wire, not too heavy. You've got to try and keep it as light as possible. You can even go onto a fine wire hook if you like. The silk's introduced out the head, taken down the shank in the usual way, neat touching turns. In this case it's gossamer silk, waxed with the usual Vineyard solid wax. And at this point, somewhere just about opposite the point of the hook, which is just masked underneath the jaws of the vise, we introduce the tail fibres. You can either use a cock pheasant as it comes from the bird, in other words in its natural state for the 3 trident tails, or you can use a dyed one. They are better because the tails of the spent spinner are indeed very dark, almost black, and in some cases black. Now what we require are just 3 of these fibres, which I'm going to pull away. It doesn't matter if you collect 4 or 5. but you pull them down until the tips become level. They are then just cropped away. Try and keep them in the natural formation that they came off the feather if you can. Just separate them into 3. You see I'm retaining the natural formation. And the length of the tail wants to be at least as long as the shank itself. They can actually be longer, but the minimum they want to be as long as the shank itself. So gauge them up, tie them on top of the shank, and keep them in that position while the silk is taken down towards the bend. Now what we're aiming for is a trident sort of formation, and this is easily achieved. Some people tend to weave in and out, but it can be a little bit unruly with fibres as soft as these. But what I do is to bring out the far fibre, the 2 outriding fibres, the 2 outside ones, and pull them into this trident position, leaving the central one sticking straight out to the rear. This puts a little kink into the fibres, and to keep that kink there, the silk is taken right underneath the fibres and pulls them right up underneath, and the next turn of silk goes immediately on top of those and traps them into position. So we've actually trapped them into that trident position. The next job is to introduce the material which is going to form the body, and this is quite stark white, but it can be ivory coloured if you so prefer it. But I found that this nice contrasting white and darkness of mayflies does tend to work very well indeed. And all I require for this is a small web of fibres, turn them round, present them by the naturally tapered end, crop away, square them off or under the shank, and then simply take the silk forward. You don't want to go too far with this. It's going to form a little white tail end to the fly, a little white butt. And once that is formed, little jump there, tie it off, crop it away. You can see I've left these intact for this point in time, but you'll see what they are removed in a few seconds' time. For the segmentation of the body, or the feathers which help give the segmented effect, the dark bands, I'm going to introduce now a very narrow web of dyed goose, tied in exactly the same way. And all we need is 2 or 3 turns of this, just enough to make a suggestion of a dark band. And that is tied off. And what we can do, we can be quite cheeky here, we can leave that in place while the next strand of white is introduced, white herl. Because we can in fact use it again. Square off the ends as usual, trap in, take the silk back up to the start of the last black band, the outer edge of the black band, then wind on again, tie that off, cut away. These can now be removed, and this leftover from the last black band can now be used to form the second black band. It's just to give the impression of the adult fly's markings on the body. It hasn't got to be really precise, provided that you're giving this suggestion of a light and dark banded body. Now, all we need now is a nice generous web to finish off the body, and I'm going to take this right out of this section here, take a nice long broad section to finish off the body itself. Offer it up, double this one, want that little bit extra thickness, offer under the shank, wind back to the end of this segment and then back along the shank towards the eye. And this time we want to go to at least the 3/4 mark position, perhaps a little beyond there. The body can now be formed. Nice touching turns, throwing the herl or the nap uppermost until you reach the silk and then tie off. Tie the butt ends down, make them nice and neat, and you want a nice firm bed on which to lay the wings now, so give it plenty of tension and make a nice flat firm bed on which to lay the wings. Now the wings for this pattern are going to be tied in the spent fashion, and what I like to use, there's two types of feathers actually. This one is the silver mallard flank. As you can see, I've picked out a pair, matching pair. They're laid tip on tip. Make sure you get the ends completely squarely together. And then this superfluous material is then stripped away. And what you're aiming for, and I have two that I've already prepared here, are two feathers which are as near identical as possible. And the length wants to be from the stem to the tip of the feather, approximately 2 centimetres. And these are tied in on top of the shank in this way. The stalk of the prepared feather is offered across the shank of the hook, lashed down quite firmly with 2 turns in the one direction, 2 in the other, in other words, in a figure of 8 manner, but make these really tight. And what you're aiming for is this nice 90-degree angle to the shank of the hook, as you see there. Having done that, leave this stalk where it is and simply go across with the second one, laying it completely on top. It's a little tricky manoeuvre this. You have to fiddle around and get hold of the stem, bring it back onto top of the shank of the hook, line it up with this other stem, and then hold it in that position while it's locked in this figure of 8 form, as you see there. Now once it's in place, give the whole of it another extra turn or two. You can't overdo it on this particular pattern. And take hold of the stems, bring them into the forward position. It's a little tricky this, try not to get hold of any of the wing fibres. Sometimes they'll come, sometimes they won't. And then simply bind them down forward. Cut away the waist. Bind down the raw ends. We're now ready to introduce the hattle, which in this case is a very low quality furnace or cockybondu. It doesn't really matter which, but it's a very low quality cock hattle. Strip away the fibres as usual, and it's a very, what we call a henny cock, very soft. It's not to support the fly on the water. The tails and the wings will do just that. So all we do now is introduce that, a little tricky because we've got to get in between the dressing there, in between the wings, and lash it down, clip away the waist. I'm not going to pull this out as I very often do. The hattle is now taken into the pliers and wound one turn through the wings, right between them. Make one turn behind, a complete turn, back through the wings once more. Keep lifting the wings and pushing them into position, and then take 2 turns in front of the wing. You don't need a lot of hattle, just enough to suggest the legs and the dark thoracic area, and then the whip finish. Right, having done that, all we need to do now is to realign the wings, because they've been pushed out of the way while we've been playing around, and get them into this nice horizontal position. We've got the nice trident tail. These snowshoes, I always say that these wings look a little bit like snowshoes, and they act like them on the water. In fact, they do support it very nicely. The hattles sink into the water and they look like they simulate the legs. So there's the finished fly. Right, the mayfly done. This time I'm dressing it on a short shank hook. It's a size 10 standard shanked hook. The tails have been introduced, and these are cock pheasant centre tail feathers, tied once again on the trident sort of shape. The body is a nice olive herl, which has been ribbed through with a number 2, a very fine gold flat tinsel. We're now ready for the fan wings to go in at this stage. The wings are taken from, or made from, 2 curly breast feathers from a mallard duck, and you see the superfluous material has been stripped away until the correct size. A little unruly, these feathers, due to the curly nature. And what we do now is get them paired up so that they're correct length and laying one on top of the other. Offer them up under the shank, and there they're gripped. Tied into position, the silk brought back up to the junction of the stalks, and bring them into an upright position and take laps of silk right up to the junction to stand them into a nice upright position. And there, that gives you the nice fan-winged effect. And just snip away the waist stalks. We're now ready to introduce the hattle. You can use either a cocky bondu, a furnace,